The Vexley family's arrival in Milford in the winter of 1908 was quiet but impossible to ignore for the handful of families that made up the rural outskirts of the town. Edward Vexley was a man of severe posture and careful speech, his presence marked by a cold, watchful intensity that left those who met him feeling as though they had revealed more than they intended. He had come into a modest inheritance following the death of his elder brother in New York, and with that money he purchased a stretch of prairie land just beyond the tree line where the earth turned dark and rich after the thaw. Locals remembered seeing the wagons arrive under a thin layer of frost, carrying not only furniture and tools but also large, heavy trunks, whose contents no one ever learned. Margaret Vexley, Edward's wife, was pale and quiet, wearing a mourning black that seemed strange to those who didn't know of her own family's recent tragedy. The three children, Daniel, Alice, and little Thomas, were huddled close to her as if the cold itself had driven them together for warmth. Edward wasted no time beginning construction on a house that dwarfed the humble farmhouses nearby. Built in the stark Carpenter Gothic style, its sharp angles and high gables cast long shadows that stretched across the prairie when the sun dipped low. Neighbors watched from a distance as Edward worked alongside hired men, hammering late into the night with lanterns glowing from the upper windows like watchful eyes. Some swore they saw more figures on the property than there were workers, silhouettes moving in the lamplight even after the laborers had gone home. It was said that Edward would often dismiss the men before dusk, but remain outside himself, digging in the fields long after the others had retired. What he buried or unearthed was never discovered, though deep mounds of turned soil would sometimes appear in the morning as though the earth had been restless. Once the house was complete by early spring, the family withdrew into it as if into a fortress. The children were seen only rarely, darting through the tall grass or peering from the upper windows as passers-by made their way to town. Margaret would sometimes walk the property line humming softly to herself, her steps slow and deliberate, as though she were tracing a path she had walked many times before. Those who greeted her said she spoke kindly but with an absent-minded air, as if her thoughts were elsewhere. Edward, on the other hand, grew more abrupt, answering questions with as few words as possible and making it clear that he valued privacy above neighborly chatter. Life in Milford at that time was harsh, and the arrival of a family who kept to themselves became a subject of fascination and unease. Farmers spoke of seeing lights dancing in the Vexley windows at hours when decent folk were asleep. Deliverymen reported hearing strange thumps and dragging sounds from inside the house, as if furniture were being moved across the floor again and again. Children in town began daring each other to approach the edge of the Vexley property, claiming they had heard whispers on the wind that called their names in voices not quite human. Adults dismissed these tales, though few were willing to walk the road by the house after dark. What unsettled the townsfolk most was the sense that the house itself seemed to settle differently on the land than other homes. After heavy rains, mist would gather around its foundation and linger there while the rest of the prairie dried in the sun. Dogs would whine and refuse to go near the fence line. One farmhand refused to work past sundown near the property, saying that the sound of digging came from the fields, even when no one was there. When asked, Edward offered no explanation and seemed almost amused at the suggestion that anything unusual was happening. By the end of their first year in Milford, the Vexley family had become the subject of both suspicion and pity. Some believed they had suffered too much loss in their previous life and had come here to escape the world. Others whispered that they were hiding something more sinister. The house stood tall and proud, its narrow windows catching the last light of day like watchful eyes, and the wind that swept across the fields carried a sound that could never be mistaken for laughter or song. By the second year of their life in Milford, the Vexley family's strangeness had stopped being a curiosity and had begun to take root as a quiet source of fear among the neighboring farms. It was no longer just the house that seemed out of place, but the family themselves, as though they were becoming part of something larger and unseen that no one else could name. Edward was rarely seen in daylight except to ride into town for supplies, and when he did, he carried himself with a grim purpose that discouraged conversation. His shoulders seemed tighter, his jaw set, and his eyes moved as though scanning for something only he could sense. Margaret was seen even less frequently, and when she did appear, her face was thinner, her black dresses now worn and frayed as if mourning had outlived its rightful season. Neighbors whispered that she had been heard speaking softly at night, not to Edward or the children, but to someone beyond the walls, her words indistinguishable yet marked by a strange cadence like a prayer spoken backward. The children, once glimpsed playing in the tall grass, now seemed confined almost entirely to the house. Daniel, the eldest, was spotted one afternoon standing at an upstairs window for hours, unmoving, his eyes following something across the fields that no one else could see. Alice was heard crying once near the back porch, but was quickly pulled inside by Margaret before anyone could approach. As for little Thomas, he had become so rarely seen that some neighbors speculated he had taken ill. There were no visits from a doctor, no signs of nursing, only a pale, small shadow that sometimes darted past the curtains, as if fearful of being spotted. It was during this time that reports of strange sounds began to spread through Milford. Passing farmhands claimed they heard shovels striking earth at midnight, the sound carrying across the prairie even though no lanterns were visible. Others swore they heard the creak of the house as though someone were walking its halls long after the lamps had been extinguished. On windless nights, the air seemed to vibrate faintly, a low hum that rolled over the ground and made the hair stand up on the back of one's neck. The sheriff himself rode out one evening after several complaints but found nothing unusual except for Edward standing silently by the fence, watching him approach without a word until the sheriff turned his horse back toward town. Stories grew with each passing month. A farmwife swore she saw Edward carrying something wrapped in burlap into the cellar late one night, his lantern swinging low, the bundle shifting as though it were not entirely still. A deliveryman claimed that when Margaret opened the front door to receive a package, the hall behind her was lined with candles, dozens of them, flickering in such a way that they seemed to stretch the shadows into strange, twisting shapes. One neighbor recalled that her own children came home terrified after finding small piles of bones arranged carefully in the grass near the Vexley fence. They were the size of birds or rabbits, but placed in a perfect circle, as though meant for some ritual no one dared name. The growing unease began to divide the small community. Some insisted the family was troubled and needed help. Others warned that it was best to leave them alone. There were those who believed the land itself was cursed, that Edward had disturbed something buried long before he ever set foot there. Even the church pastor mentioned the Vexleys during a sermon one Sunday, urging his congregation to pray for them while also keeping a safe distance, advice that only fed the fearful imagination of the town. By the end of 1911, what had once been curiosity had turned to dread. No one went near the house unless they had to, and even then they avoided looking directly at the windows, where some swore faces appeared at night, pale and pressed against the glass. The road that passed by the property was nearly abandoned after sunset, travellers choosing longer routes rather than risk whatever waited in the darkness by the Vexley farm. The family, still secluded within their home, became less like neighbours and more like phantoms. Their presence felt more strongly in absence than when they were seen, as though the house and its occupants had begun to draw in the attention of something far beyond the town's understanding. It was during the bitter month of February 1912 that the Vexley family's unease turned into something darker and far more disturbing when the youngest child, Thomas, disappeared without a trace. The boy had always been a small and frail thing, quiet even among his siblings, often spotted clinging to Margaret's skirt when the rare visitor came to call. His absence was first noticed by a neighbouring farmhand who swore he had seen Edward walking the fields before sunrise, carrying what looked like the boy's small boots in one hand. By that evening, Thomas was nowhere to be seen, and unlike most families in Milford, the Vexleys made no public announcement, no plea for help, and no request for search parties. Days passed, and the only sign of the boy was a small wooden toy horse left abandoned near the porch steps, its head cracked clean off as though someone had stepped on it in haste. The town was shaken by the quiet around the disappearance. Mothers kept their children close, and whispers started to spread that something terrible had happened behind the walls of that looming house. A few brave men offered to help search the fields, but Edward turned them away at the gate with a look that allowed no argument. He claimed Thomas had gone to stay with relatives back east, though no one in town had ever heard of such relations, and the story changed slightly depending on who asked. Margaret was spotted a few days later, her face drawn and hollow, her eyes rimmed red as though she had been weeping. Yet, when greeted, she offered only a thin, unsettling smile and retreated back inside without another word. Rumors spread that strange things began happening on the property after Thomas vanished. The family was heard moving about the house at all hours, heavy footsteps echoing along the floorboards long after midnight. Some said they heard shouting, others claimed to hear singing. Not the kind of singing one might use to soothe grief, but a slow, droning chant that carried across the empty fields. Farm dogs that had once prowled freely near the property now whined and pulled away from it, refusing to approach even when urged. On one moonless night, a neighbor reported seeing lanterns bobbing out in the fields, not carried by any visible person but moving in jerks and arcs as though guided by some invisible hand. Children from the town told stories of waking up from nightmares about a boy crying in the distance, calling their names from somewhere beneath the ground. One girl swore she had heard scratching under her bedroom floor that stopped only when she screamed. Parents dismissed these tales as imagination running wild, yet more than one adult confessed to feeling uneasy when passing the Vexley house, as if a faint knocking could be heard from deep within its walls. The sheriff made one more visit that spring to ask about the missing child, but came back pale-faced and tight-lipped, saying only that Edward had given him his word that the matter was private and closed. What unsettled the town most was that the Vexleys did not appear to mourn in any way that seemed human. There was no grave dug, no marker placed, no ceremony of any kind. Instead, Edward spent long hours outside digging in different corners of the field, his lantern swaying back and forth until the first light of dawn, while Margaret stood on the porch, clutching something close to her chest, watching him work with an expression no one could read. When asked what he was doing, Edward replied only that he was tending to the land, though the earth he disturbed was left in uneven mounds that looked more like shallow graves than anything a farmer might prepare. By summer, the disappearance had faded from active conversation, but the shadow it cast remained heavy. Travelers spoke of hearing soft sobs coming from the house as they passed, though no one could say whether they belonged to Margaret, Alice, or something else entirely. The remaining children grew more withdrawn, Daniel refusing to speak to anyone at all, and Alice appearing pale and thin, as though she too might vanish if one looked away for too long. Those who caught sight of them said their faces were blank, their eyes glassy, and that they seemed to be listening for something that no one else could hear. As autumn crept in, the fields around the property seemed to grow unusually thick with weeds and gnarled roots, making the earth difficult to walk. Some believed the land was rejecting them, others feared it was feeding on their presence. Whatever the truth, Thomas's absence became the silent center of the Vexley home, a void that grew heavier with each passing night, pulling the family, and perhaps something else, deeper into whatever darkness had begun to take hold of them. By the winter of 1914, the Vexley family had withdrawn almost completely from the world beyond their fence, as though the house itself had swallowed them whole. The shutters were often drawn even in daylight, and smoke rose from the chimney at strange hours, sometimes in thin black columns that carried a bitter smell across the prairie. No one saw Daniel or Alice for weeks at a time, and when they were spotted they were gaunt and pale, their clothing hanging loose as if they had outgrown it too quickly or not eaten enough to fill it out. Edward was seen digging again, but now the holes were deeper, wider, as though he were trying to bury something too large to be hidden in a single night. Margaret walked the property line more frequently, but no longer with the quiet hum of before. Now she muttered rapidly under her breath, her lips barely moving, and neighbors who caught sight of her swore that her shadow stretched unnaturally long even when the sun was directly overhead. One cold evening in January, a passing farmer noticed every window of the Vexley house glowing with light. Not the warm yellow of lanterns, but a flickering red that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. He later told others that as he approached he heard what sounded like multiple voices inside speaking in unison, rising and falling in a rhythm that made his stomach twist. He fled before reaching the porch, and by morning the house was dark again, the windows bare and empty. Rumors spread quickly through Milford that something was being called into that house, something that did not belong there. The church bells rang that Sunday louder than ever before, as though to push back whatever had taken root at the edge of town. In March of that year, the first reports came that the Vexleys had not been seen for several days. A supply delivery sat untouched by the gate, its contents slowly spoiling in the sun. The sheriff was convinced to investigate, though he went alone, riding out under a grey sky that seemed to hang low over the fields. He later told only one person in confidence what he had seen: the house silent, the front door unlocked, the interior in disarray as though a great wind had swept through, scattering papers and breaking furniture. The hearth was cold, and upstairs the beds were unmade but empty, the sheets still faintly warm as though someone had just risen and vanished. In the cellar he found marks on the walls, long gouges as if made by fingernails, and a smell so overpowering he nearly fainted. He left without touching a thing and advised the town that the family had gone away suddenly. Within days, neighbors noticed a new addition to the property, a small family plot near the far corner of the field, 6 rough stones driven into the earth, each bearing a name hastily carved with uneven hands. No one saw the graves being dug, and no one saw the bodies laid to rest, but Edward's name was among them, along with Margaret's, Daniel's, Alice's, and even little Thomas, who had vanished 2 years prior. The sight of the plot chilled the town. No one dared approach to confirm what had been buried there, and by unspoken agreement the Vexley farm was left to itself, its secrets sealed under the soil. The house began to decay almost immediately, as though whatever had held it together had fled with its inhabitants. Shingles fell from the roof, even in mild weather, boards warped and split, and the once proud structure began to lean slightly as if bowing under the weight of something invisible. The wind that passed through its empty halls carried strange tones, not quite whistling, not quite words, but enough to make travelers quicken their steps when crossing that stretch of road. Children were warned never to go near, and grown men admitted to feeling watched when they passed too close, their eyes drawn again and again to the dark windows where something seemed to linger. By the first frost of that year, the farm had taken on a reputation as a cursed place, a stretch of land where birds refused to roost and crops failed to grow. The graves remained untouched, marked only by the crude stones and the occasional scatter of dead leaves that collected around them like offerings. At night, some claimed to see faint lantern light drifting from one grave to the next, as though someone were still tending to them. Others spoke of hearing soft, muffled crying carried on the wind, and though no one admitted it aloud, more than a few believed that whatever had claimed the Vexleys had not been finished with them yet. In the years that followed the sudden vanishing of the Vexley family, the house remained standing like a black scar on the land, its windows staring out across the prairie like hollow eyes. Seasons came and went, snow gathered in heavy drifts against the sagging porch in winter, and weeds grew tall in summer, curling up through the floorboards as though the earth itself was trying to reclaim the structure. Travelers passing by on the road spoke of hearing the sound of footsteps on the porch, even when the house stood empty, and some claimed to glimpse movement behind the curtains, as if someone was still living there, watching quietly from the shadows. The family plot at the edge of the property became overgrown, the names on the stones slowly wearing away under wind and rain until they were nearly unreadable. The townsfolk kept their distance, but the presence of the house was a weight they all felt, a reminder of something unresolved, a secret still breathing beneath the soil. By the 1920s, the farm had become a landmark of fear for Milford's children, a place where they dared one another to approach the fence line or touch the front steps under the pale light of the moon. Those who accepted the dare often came running back with pale faces and wide eyes, swearing they had heard whispers coming from inside or felt a sudden chill pass through them like a hand brushing over their skin. Some swore they saw pale faces staring from the upper windows, not quite human, and one boy claimed that he saw a figure digging in the field with a lantern, the light swinging back and forth before vanishing completely. Adults dismissed these tales, but none could deny the feeling of unease that crept over anyone who lingered too close to the house after dark. Over the decades, the structure began to rot from the inside out. Floorboards caved in, the roof collapsed in places, and yet the house never seemed to fully fall, as if it refused to surrender to time. Some locals said that was because it was being kept standing by something that lived there still, something that would not allow its shelter to be destroyed. A traveling preacher once attempted to bless the property, gathering a small group at the fence to pray, but before the final words could be spoken, a storm swept in from a clear sky with such ferocity that the group fled for their lives. After that day, no one tried to sanctify the land again. The farm became an unspoken boundary, a place children were forbidden to go, and adults crossed themselves when passing. By the 1950s, the house was little more than a shell, its once sharp angles now crooked and sinking, yet the stories surrounding it only grew darker. Couples parked on the road at night swore they saw lights moving through the house as though lanterns had been lit, and more than one traveler who tried to take shelter there during a storm claimed they were driven out by a sudden, overwhelming smell of decay and the sound of something scratching beneath the floor. Hunters reported finding animal carcasses near the property, small and perfectly arranged in spirals, as if left as an offering or warning. Despite the danger, There was always someone drawn to the place, as though it exerted a quiet pull on those willing to listen. In 1965, a group of teenagers from a neighboring town broke into the house on Halloween night, bringing lanterns and daring each other to stay until midnight. They returned home before dawn, shaken and pale, refusing to speak of what had happened inside, though one was said to have been found days later wandering the fields barefoot, muttering about hearing a boy crying from under the floor. That incident reignited the old fears, and some of the town elders suggested burning the house down to finally rid the land of whatever lingered there. But before any plan could be made, a sudden fire broke out one summer night, consuming much of the house but leaving the foundation and cellar blackened yet intact, as though the blaze had been selective in what it destroyed. Even after the fire, the remains of the house stood like a warning, its charred frame casting strange shadows at sunset. Those who passed by said the smell of smoke lingered for years, strong enough to sting the nose even when no fire burned nearby. The family plot was still there, the stones still crooked, and some claimed the soil around them had sunk deeper, as though something below had been shifting slowly, patiently, waiting for the day it might come back to the surface. In the summer of 1972, the long silence surrounding the Vexley property was broken when a development company purchased the land with the intent to clear it and build a row of modern houses. Milford had grown since the early century, and the empty acreage was considered prime ground despite its dark reputation. Heavy machinery was brought in, and for the first time in decades men set foot on the soil with the purpose of tearing down what remained of the house. What they found unnerved even the most hardened workers. The ground around the property was soft in strange places, sinking slightly underfoot as if hollow beneath the surface, and the cellar had remained intact, its stone walls blackened but still standing. A foreman described the smell that greeted them when they first pried open the cellar door as something between rotting earth and stagnant water, so foul that several workers refused to go any further. Before construction could continue, it was decided that the family plot would need to be exhumed and properly relocated. The task fell to a small team hired to move the remains, who arrived on a humid morning and began carefully digging around the crude stones. Within hours the work stopped, and word spread quickly that something was terribly wrong. The first coffin they opened was empty, the wood splintered and clawed on the inside as though someone had tried desperately to escape. The second coffin was the same, and so were the rest. Every grave hollow, every lid fractured from within, no remains left to account for the 6 people believed to be buried there. The men were shaken, some refusing to continue, others swearing they would not set foot on the property again. One worker vomited in the grass and claimed he heard breathing just beneath the soil as he stood near the last grave. The sheriff was called, and he arrived with 2 deputies to inspect the site. They confirmed the discovery but offered no explanation, noting only that the graves seemed older than they should have, the wood more rotted than 6 decades of burial could account for, as though something had sped the process of decay. A small crowd gathered at the fence that evening, watching silently as the workers covered the graves again and left the plot untouched. No one spoke loudly, and several of the older residents crossed themselves as they turned to leave, whispering that the land should never have been disturbed. The foreman halted work for several days, claiming the equipment would not run properly, the engines failing to start no matter how many times they were repaired. When the crew finally returned, they reported strange occurrences each night they stayed on site. Tools went missing and were later found arranged in circles. Freshly dug earth appeared filled in by morning as though no work had been done. Lanterns were seen flickering inside the ruined frame of the house despite no one being inside, and one man swore he saw a figure standing at the edge of the field watching him, though when he called out, it vanished into the tall grass. Another worker claimed to hear children laughing softly from the direction of the cellar, though when he approached it the sound stopped abruptly, leaving only the creak of insects and the stillness of the night. By August, the project was abandoned entirely. The company withdrew its plans, citing unsuitable ground conditions, though those who had been there told another story, one of sleepless nights and a sense of dread that grew heavier with every day they worked. The property was fenced off, left to the weeds and the crows once more, but the memory of the empty coffins lingered like a sickness over Milford. Some of the townspeople began leaving offerings at the gate, flowers, small carved crosses, and even toys, as though trying to appease whatever had been disturbed. Others swore they heard knocking coming from the ground near the plot at night, slow and deliberate, as though something was calling to be let out. As autumn approached, the house seemed to resist even the final stages of its collapse. Its charred frame remained upright despite storms, and some said that on certain nights the windows glowed faintly red, pulsing like a heartbeat, just as they had before the family vanished. Travelers avoided the road entirely, and those who were forced to pass kept their heads down, unwilling to look toward the ruins. The Vexley farm became once again what it had always been, a place left alone, its secret buried but restless, its silence deeper now that the earth had been stirred and nothing had been found except the hollow space where the family should have been. In the years following the aborted 1972 excavation, the Vexley property became something far darker than a mere ruin. What had once been a place of whispered rumors and campfire stories became an active source of dread that seeped into the lives of Milford's residents. People began reporting strange disturbances even miles away from the farm. Cattle were found dead in the fields with no wounds and no tracks leading to them, their bodies arranged in eerie patterns that no natural predator could have made. Travelers along the main road claimed to see figures standing by the fence at night, their forms too tall and too thin to be human, vanishing when headlights passed over them. Those who lived closest to the property said they heard sounds like scratching under the ground, faint at first, then louder as though something was working its way upward, claw by claw. The abandoned house became a magnet for the curious, though few who ventured near stayed long. Amateur ghost hunters came with cameras and tape recorders, but most left with nothing but fear. One group claimed that when they played back their recordings, they heard a child's voice whispering over and over, begging to be let out. Another visitor reported that every time he stepped onto the porch, he heard knocking from beneath the floorboards in a steady, rhythmic pattern like the beating of a heart. Even hardened skeptics admitted that the property had an atmosphere that was impossible to ignore, a heaviness in the air that made breathing feel difficult and turned stomachs sour. Residents began to notice a change in the land itself. Trees near the property line grew twisted, their branches curling toward the ground as if bent under some unseen weight. Grass refused to grow evenly, leaving patches of dead earth that looked almost scorched. At night, strange lights were seen weaving through the fields, moving too fast and too erratically to be lanterns, and some swore that they heard low voices carried on the wind, speaking in a language no one could recognize. There were even reports of laughter, soft and childlike, coming from the direction of the graves just before dawn, a sound so out of place that it left even the most skeptical listeners shaken. The fear grew so strong that by the late 1970s, several families living nearby abandoned their homes altogether, unwilling to raise children so close to what they believed to be cursed ground. The church once again held special services, urging the town to keep faith, but even the pastor confessed privately that he avoided traveling past the property after dark. The sheriff refused to send deputies to respond to calls from that stretch of road unless absolutely necessary. And when he did, the reports they filed were short and deliberately vague, as if none of them wished to put into words exactly what they had seen or heard while near the ruins. Teenagers, as they had for decades, dared each other to go near, but their games often ended in terror. More than one group came running back to town in the middle of the night, swearing that they had seen the ground near the graves moving, heaving like breath, as though something alive lay just beneath the surface. One boy refused to speak for 3 days after such a visit, and when he finally did, all he could say was that he had seen a small hand reaching up from the dirt before vanishing again. His family left Milford within the month, abandoning their farm and never returning. By the time the 1980s came, the Vexley farm had passed beyond the point of being merely a decaying property. It was regarded almost like a wound in the land, a place where something unnatural had taken hold and would never release its grip. Locals would not hunt near it, would not till the soil near its edges, and some refused even to speak the family's name aloud. At night, the road past the property lay completely silent, and the house, still standing in its blackened, skeletal form, seemed to grow taller in the dark, its windows glowing faintly as though lit from within. Whatever had begun with the Vexleys had not ended with their disappearance, and those who lived nearby learned to watch the sky and the fields and to pray that whatever waited out there would stay buried a little longer.